James Lindsay, about a month ago, delivered a lecture on his belief that communism is a religion called Communism 1.0, Theoretical Communism. Of course, people comparing communism to a cult is nothing new. People point out that the personality cults of Lenin, Stalin, and the dear leader of the DPRK existed all the time, but what's novel about Lindsay's take is that he's arguing that the whole theoretical foundation of communism is a kind of religion of human transformation. I take issue with this view for many reasons. The theoretical doctrine of Marxism is affirmatively materialistic, as Marx finds the basis for human behavior and consciousness in material relationships. That material relationships determine human consciousness is one of the laws of dialectics, which is the transformation of quantity into quality. To see in this process any kind of spiritual transformation can be nothing other than a strained analogy, and in fact, this is exactly what the whole lecture is, a strained analogy. His first argument is that Marxism is evolutionary, and so it is thus similar to religions. One might think that religions suppose that there is some kind of evolution of the soul or evolution of humanity, but the reality is the opposite. Nearly every religion has some historical theory of cyclical decline rather than evolution, and soteriology, the salvation of the soul, is not an evolutionary doctrine either. Evolution, in the sense that the term is being employed here, is gradual progression toward perfection over time. But soteriology takes place outside of time in the eternal. A soul that is saved eternally by the action of God. There isn't a procession of various phases in which the soul is more or less saved, but rather it is simply done according to his will. The context in which Christian soteriology takes place in, for example, is also not whatsoever evolutionary. It is de-evolutionary. In the Bible, Jesus condemns the generation of his time as being an adulterous generation, and the context in which Jesus' mission takes place in is in a phase of religious decline. Money changers are setting up tables at temples, homosexuality is prevalent, and the Roman state is encroaching into every aspect of life, for example, forcing Jews into a position where they have to accept idolatry, i.e. the face of the god emperor on coinage. It's made very clear that the reason why God sent his son to sacrifice himself is because of the apocalyptic lateness of the hour. Society had degenerated to the point where the old law could no longer serve mankind, and the Pharisees had degenerated the law into a merely juridical paradigm, so man required a spiritual savior. We can say that theosophism is evolutionistic, but here Lindsay is being confused in his analogy. He later says that he doesn't want to imply that religion, theosophism, and esotericism are the same, but when he makes this criticism, he makes no effort to identify specifically what variant of spirituality is evolutionistic. It is, at least, as if he is treating them as the same. He reveals his position on spirituality later when he remarks that spiritualism is just fantasy, so I think deep inside, Lindsay views these things as synonymous. As far as theosophism is specifically concerned, we will get to that near the end of the video. Lindsay, quoting Marx, argues that communism is similar to religions in the sense that they command people to strip themselves of the past. Perhaps he is here speaking of esotericism specifically, insofar as esoteric spirituality requires man to give up his current form. But religions in no way command people to strip off the past. The past is incredibly important to religions because it establishes a tradition. Moreover, religions could be said to actually take place in the present rather than the past or future, since the purpose of a religion is to establish an ongoing connection to God and to the divine for the sake of human salvation. Religions are not simple atavisms nor cultural traditions. They are a way of life that brings the eternally true into present reality. Likewise, in valid esoteric traditions, the fallen human form is not the past, but rather it is bound up with time itself. The journey from the fallen state to the state of mystical union is a journey out of time and into the point where time intersects eternity, the present. The past is continually carried into the present, which is an expression I am borrowing from Julius Evola, resulting in a continual restoration of what was and is always valid. In the end, it is not a matter of stripping off the past, it is a supreme justification of the past in the present. What Lindsay also ignores is that his liberalism, also a revolutionary ideology, calls people to strip away the past. In France, the past was represented by the Ancien regime, and the liberal revolutionaries posited an ideology of an ascendant and idealized future, which sounds an awful lot like communism to me. Likewise, the liberal argument that they were guaranteeing the happiness of man by freeing him from historical oppressions is obviously similar in tone to the rhetoric of communism, where the impediment against human happiness was not monarchy, but instead capitalism. Are we to then, based on this discovery, declare that liberalism is a religion or an esotericism? Of course not. All revolutionary movements have similarities, and it is far more fruitful to recognize movements for what they are. Communism and liberalism were both secular revolutions designed to overthrow past structures of hegemony. And as Julius Evolet has pointed out, each revolution was essentially the overthrow of rule by the superior caste that came before it in favor of domination by an inferior caste that carried out that revolution. When the Ancien regime was overthrown by the French revolutionaries, it was replaced by the rule of the Third Estate, or the bourgeoisie. When communists overthrew the Russian monarchy, it was replaced by a dictatorship of the proletariat. Each revolution had its aim the casting aside of the vestments and authorities of the past in favor of a secular future ruled by the masses. Both communism and liberalism are based on the idea that man's happiness is impeded by the existence of oppression. Liberals believe that the monarchies were oppressing them and preventing them from self-government, which was supposed to guarantee happiness for every man. Communism and liberalism have the same dialectic, and the only way Lindsay can deflect from this is by attempting to cast communism as an irrational New Age movement rather than engaging it on its own terms. The secular liberal theory goes that religion is irrational, and irrational ideologies are bound to have disastrous consequences. A rational political program like liberal rationalism is good and will lead to beneficial outcomes. Communism has had bad outcomes, such as the death of, as Lindsay says, 200 million people, a figure that I haven't heard before, so it must be irrational like religion. There's no room in Lindsay's worldview for a revolutionary movement following similar logic to the one that he is a part of that is just as rational having bad outcomes. The root of communism is perfectly rationally consistent. The nature of history is dialectics. Man is formed by material relationships, which is a premise, and these relationships create dialectics, such as bourgeoisie and proletariat, or oppressor and oppressed. History is driven by dialectical conflict, the negation of the negation, and synthesis. The negation of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is the classless society. This is at least as rationally consistent as the idea of the natural freedom of man, private property arising from mixing labor with land or capital, and government arising from common consent. We could even argue that yet another similarity between communism and liberalism is the notion that man is naturally born free and equal and only becomes unequal as a consequence of oppression by states. Lindsay insists that the communist utopia is like a heaven on earth, and that the revolutionary method that leads to it is like a religion. Is it not also true that liberals envision a kind of heaven stage in the form of self-rule? The history of man has been oppression by tyrants who violate the consent of the people. The path to heaven is the overthrow of these tyrants by revolution, so that the heaven of government by consent can be established, and we thus return to the naturally free state of man. If we want to adopt this paradigm that revolutionary movements are like religions, then liberalism has as much claim to building the third temple or immanentizing the eschaton as communism does. Lindsay also argues at one point that, similar to a spiritual belief system, communism posits an original communism and prehistoric tribalism, then human evolution continues in a spiral form so that we once again arrive at communism at a higher level. Does liberalism also not posit this, that man is more free under liberalism than he was in the initial anarchic state of existence, and yet he also remains equal in both stages? Perhaps man is even more equal under the state now that he does not have to deal with the difficulties and differences in nature. We might even go further and suppose that the modern liberal notion of progress is akin to the Hegelian notion of progress adopted by the communists. Liberals believe that human ingenuity will continue bettering the condition of humanity over time due to advances in civics and technology. Humanity is continually getting better and better, and gradually becoming more and more unified until we've reached the goal of humanistic world peace. This is the modern liberal worldview. How is it in any substantial way different in form from the communist belief in progress? He does not know the debt that communism owes to liberalism, and is unwilling to admit that they share a political space. Every belief system has a gradation of knowledge and an intellectual elite. In liberalism, this task is distributed to technically skilled people who lead in various industries as well as politicians. Complex systems are supposed to determine the course that humanity will take in liberalism, and these complex systems are ran by an intellectual and industry elite population. It is not whatsoever a unique feature of Marxism or religion that elites are tasked with the leadership of nations and peoples. The most facile comparison Lindsay makes is with Gnosticism. Gnosticism supposed that human life is the result of a trick by a malevolent being called the Demiurge. The Demiurge tricked Sophia, who represents divine wisdom, into entrapping the divine spark into corruptible matter. Gnosticism, as such, is a religion, or an esotericism, more accurately, that hyper-emphasizes transcendence as opposed to materiality, which is as clear an opposite to the communist idea of historical dialectics as possible. The broad analogy that Lindsay makes is that remembrance of the social nature of humanity is like knowledge of the divine spark, that rule of society by capitalists is like being trapped in matter, and that the leadership of humanity by communist intellectuals is supposed to be like the existence of masters of spiritual wisdom among the Gnostics who know the true path to getting woke or escaping the material plane. But again, as I've already stated, the idea that individuals hold some kind of special wisdom or prowess that qualifies them for leading peoples and nations is in no way unique to religion or Gnosticism. Everyone from Plato to Richard Hanania has deferred to human expertise on matters of rule, whether that's the form of a philosopher king or the elite participants in complex systems. This trust of mass wisdom is at least as common in boardrooms as it is in a Gnostic sect, and the notion that rule by capitalists is akin to being trapped does not comport with Marx's theory. Marx saw capitalism as essentially progressive, bringing man out of feudal conditions. His theory of history is dialectical, and dialectics is in no way assuming that man is trapped by his circumstances. It obviously is a progressive notion of history, so the idea that man is somehow petrified into a single period is nonsense. The idea of an awakening to conditions that one was not aware of beforehand is not specifically a spiritual concept. Marx deduces class consciousness entirely from dialectics. This whole analogy that communism is like Gnosticism is very strained. Lindsay also insists that the common thread between religion and communism is that it posits a transformation of man, that there is a path from capitalist individualism to the revolutionary emergence of a new socialist man who is part of a universal human collective, just as a cell is a member of the body in a single evolutionary organism. This is supposed to be like the redemption of man and the expiation of Adam's sin that transforms his fallen nature into a heavenly one, like the biblical putting on the new man. But here I must intervene and give the most central argument to my criticism of Lindsay's paradigm, which is that Lindsay doesn't respect religion on its own terms. Religions are fundamentally paths to religious salvation based on spiritual realities. The essence of religion is that spirituality, and without it, it's only a pseudo-religion. Lindsay is unwilling to grant that what defines religion is the real, effective spiritual grace that practicing it can bestow. What makes a religion is that efficacy. It's why all valid religious traditions produce saints, and all invalid ones like Theosophism do not. The spiritual transformation that takes place in the heart of a religious man is in no way similar to the social engineering that communists promise to carry out, and which, as Lindsay has said, has led to the deaths of millions of people. Religion is not a social engineering project. It only has salvific potential if you actively practice it and internalize the religion. One could theoretically exist in a communist utopia without necessarily internalizing communism at all, and if the system actually worked, you would benefit from it. But religion is intensely personal and anti-collectivistic. The transformation that communism promises is collective and compulsory. The transformation that religion promises is personal, based on one's own consent, as well as being genuinely spiritual. Lindsay argues that Marx was steeped in wizardry, and that philosophers like Hegel were writing in an environment surrounded by occult ideas in what he terms theosophy, by which he basically just means occultism. While it's true that these writers are probably in great proximity to occultism, it would be a leap to say that ipso facto they are receiving occult ideas by osmosis. While reading Capital, I never once got the impression that Marx was inspired by occult ideas, since the whole book is a treatise on material relations, and I'm quite familiar with various occult ideas myself. Likewise, in Dialectics of Nature, Engels writes a scathing critique of spirituality and science, citing spiritual magnetism and mesmerism as examples of pseudoscience, not far removed from the natural philosophy of the Middle Ages. Does that sound like the position of an occultist? To me, it does not. Now, I'm not that familiar with Hegel, so I can't comment on how close idealism is to occultism, other than to say that Marx specifically wanted to take the spiritual elements out of Hegel's thought. If there were any noumenal or occult elements to Hegelianism, Marx has effectively erased them by transitioning them to material dialectics. Of course, Lindsay has a complex genealogy of occult figures connected to communist ideas in some way, like the Theosophical Society and its exponents, a subject I will get to shortly. But this doesn't prove that communism is a religion. It simply proves that there exist pseudo-religions with communist elements. To broadly call all of this communism is perhaps valid, that is a form of communism, but to blanket call all communism, like Marxism, a religion is absurd. So I will grant Lindsay one thing, which is that certain beliefs of theosophists are intensely similar to communism. Theosophists believe in the gradual evolution of humanity to higher and higher spiritual states. They believe in the collective union of humanity, and in many ways, it is a kind of spiritual communism. But is communism worldly theosophy, or is theosophy spiritual communism? The answer is affirmatively the latter. Theosophy was invented after communism, right before the turn of the 20th century. It was inspired by the prevailing currents of modern thought, through which it reinterpreted religion on a socialistic and humanitarian basis. Its similarities with communism are the result of a concurrent influence from the zeitgeist, combined with the inability of those founding it to actually get in touch with genuine spiritual reality. This is why René Guénon refers to theosophy as a pseudo-religion. It is a combination of fantasies, modern prejudices, and suspect currents of occult practice under one roof. Theosophism has been, incidentally, instrumental in the breakdown of traditional societies. For example, in India, the Theosophical Congress was a major player in ending the caste system, which was an integral part of traditional Indian spirituality. Their belief in one universal, evolving humanity led them to believe that separating man by caste was oppressive and reactionary. Again, it's like a spiritual communism. Lindsay points out that certain weirdos in the UN who are inspired by theosophy, arguing for a global transformation of human personalities into a giant mass collective, a universal human organism, exist. This attitude comes out of a synthesis of occultism, such as Eliphas Levi's occult socialism, where he proposed that every man would be taught, according to his ability, how to become a magician, outright communism, and theosophism. A good example of this is the Fellowship of New Life, associated with the Fabian Socialists, who designed much of the modern educational curriculum in the UK, bringing it in a globalist and socialistic direction. This belief in the mass alchemical reconfiguration of humanity is not itself communism, but rather it is a specific spiritual interpretation of communism that shares little in common with Marx's dialectical materialism. It is egalitarianism applied to the spirit, a modernization and proletarianization of religion. Just as Lindsay says, when you apply Marxism to race, you get critical race theory, or Marx to gender, you get critical gender theory. When you apply Marx to religion, you get theosophism. I should also point out another error Lindsay makes, however. The belief in a collective humanity is not the same as what he calls cosmological monism, which seems to mean the same thing as non-dualism, or the belief that God is one with his manifestations. The belief that material reality is an illusion, or Maya as the Hindus call it, compared to the reality of the absolute, in no way implies that material reality itself is undifferentiated. In fact, the very reason there is such a thing as multiplicity is because the absolute manifests all its possibilities, and that manifestation itself thus must become differentiated. One way to express the idea of universal union in the absolute is the concept of love. And as Julius Evola has explained, true love has boundaries. The absolute itself is undivided, but when it becomes manifest, divisions must necessarily exist, precisely because opposites cannot be resolved in manifestation. Opposites are one in the absolute, but in the material world, opposites have to manifest as separate things, and hence, we get a variegated reality full of diversity and difference. The idea of a unified humanity is really the inversion of this principle, the attempt to turn the manifest into a unity that apes the absolute. To do so would actually be contrary to the absolute's unity, because difference itself is already an expression of the possibilities of the absolute. As I will explain shortly, awakening to the unity of the absolute in no way applies dissolution of those boundaries, but rather it is the supreme affirmation of them. Again, true love has boundaries. So not all Marxists hold this spiritual worldview. In fact, it seems that only the global elite and a few certain crackpots come from this theosophical background. Most Western Marxists are atheists and postmodernists who are skeptical of religious truth claims. As such, when Lindsay calls communism a religion, he's only making a very strained analogy. Again, he just wants to excuse himself for believing in revolutionary liberalism. Lindsay also asserts that one religious feature of communism is that it sets up decisive binaries that have to be overcome. For example, male and female do not exist, they are one and the same thing. Black and white races do not exist, they are one humanity. But here, Lindsay betrays a fundamental lack of understanding of metaphysical principles and fails to do the actual task of analyzing the direction that leftism takes pairs of opposites in. Lindsay says that this idea of overcoming opposites is a communist idea because he's treating all variants of Marxism under the same umbrella. What you should actually be talking about here is post-Marxism and critical theory, but that aside, post-Marxists will argue that society creates binaries and forces people to conform to these binaries for the purposes of controlling and oppressing them. So it's not as if they're arguing that things exist as irreducible binaries. They're actually arguing that these binaries are a societal imposition, not a metaphysical principle, as would be the case in a religion. But esotericists and post-Marxists go in opposite directions regarding what should be done about these opposites. Post-Marxists argue that binaries should be amalgamated, that the differences between them should be negated through mixture to form a unity. And what's more, they typically also argue that these binaries themselves do not discretely exist, but rather everything exists on a spectrum. So it's not as simple as to say that communists are organizing things into decisive binaries. But anyway, this is the inversion of the true spiritual principle that each pair of opposites exists inside of a greater pre-existing unity. The post-Marxists want to obliterate the opposites, while esotericists want to affirm them through transcendence. The way mystics transcend the pairs of opposites is not through amalgamating them, as a magician might do, but rather they undergo an existential change into the archetype behind that pair of opposites. The basic state of the lesser mysteries is the primordial atom, who is the archetype of all humanity. To attain the state of the primordial atom is to become in oneself all of the possibilities of mankind, but to actualize only one of them. The eternal archetype actually affirms and leads back to the individual temporal manifestation of that archetype rather than demolishing it, in the same way as tracing an object back to its Platonic form does not in any way render that object obsolete or non-existent. Unity leads to multiplicity and vice versa. The practice that the post-Marxist makes use of, which is amalgamation, serves to actually destroy the manifestation of the archetype by corrupting it away from its original form. And as Plato established, the closer a manifestation is to its form, the more good it is. For example, when a biological man gets surgery to transition into a woman, he upsets his polar relationship to his own archetype and deviates from it. He may be part man and part woman, but he has not in an ontological way attained the least bit of transcendence away from the pair of opposites. He has deviated away from the good. This difference is crucial because it highlights the truth that traditional metaphysics respects differentiation and polarity in the world as a relative expression of the possibilities of the absolute. The post-Marxists, in failing to respect differentiation, instead want to achieve a unity through turning the world into a homogeneous and formless mass. In other words, rather than an order or cosmos that corresponds to unity above, they want to create a chaos which corresponds to that which is below. It is a true inversion. Speaking of above and below, Lindsay argues that the Hermetic principle of correspondence is applied in communism, which is, quoted from the Emerald Tablet, that which is above is like that which is below, that which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above, to accomplish the miracle of the one thing. He supposes that communism has a circular argument, which is that man determines society and society determines man. This is, of course, not actually true. For example, Marx believed that the base, which is economic relations, determine the superstructure, which is culture. Engels also wrote that, according to dialectical materialism, consciousness arises from material relations, not the other way around. So with Marx and Engels, it's just decisively not circular. Man is determined by material relations, and material relations are determined by historical dialectics. The post-Marxists argue the opposite, which is that the superstructure determines the base through cultural hegemony. Capitalism is sustained, for example, by homophobia, since it's designed to affirm the criteria that the only natural union is a productive union, and the productivity of the union follows the value of productivity in bourgeois society. In other words, the ethics of sexuality are the ethics of production and determine the ethics of production. Superstructure determines base. So how in any way does this match the principle of correspondence? The principle of correspondence is essentially just pointing out that the cosmos is in man and man is in the cosmos. Man is a microcosm of a macrocosm. That's the idea the Emerald Tablet is expressing. Communism in no way conceives of man as a microcosm of anything. This brings us to the ultimate end of my argumentation, which is that what Lindsay is essentially pointing out here isn't that communism is a religion, but rather he is effectively pointing out that it has inverted every principle proper to religious tradition and metaphysics. Julius Evola wrote extensively on the degree to which he saw both communism and liberalism inverting traditional values. Instead of supra-traditional unity, Marxism posits collective unity. Instead of rule by a king with a spiritual chrism, Marxism posits rule by the proletarian masses. Instead of natural order and differentiation, communism argues for equality and indifferentiation. Instead of principle as the basis for the organization of society, communism argues for labor as the center of society. We could go even further and attack Lindsay on this basis as well. Instead of supra-individual unity, liberalism calls for individualist anarchy. Instead of rule by a spiritual elite, liberalism calls for rule by the masses. Instead of the predominance of spiritual principles and laws, liberalism calls for a secular justice based on positive law and the preeminence of economic matters in society. Liberalism inverts values just as communism does. It's just that Lindsay is willfully blind to the degree to which it has done so. The effect of calling communism a religion is not just to pathologize communism, but also to pathologize religion. This is harmful to the extent that religion represents the possibility of turning back from the inverted principles of communism back toward absolute truth. Lindsay has managed to look at the major opposing force to communist thought, tradition, and to declare that it is exactly the same thing through lazy and self-interested analysis. Was he not aware that communism calls for the abolition of religion? Is he not also aware of the degree to which actual religious people are opposed to communism? Only in the mind of someone like James Lindsay is a principle like dialectical materialism rolled into a religious paradigm. Just as he has done with his definition of the woke right, he's made the most strained analogy for the purposes of rescuing the reputation of liberalism. Liberalism is rational, while communism is the deluded and irrational product of mystical thought. It's a simple dialectic that makes Lindsay sound smart and liberalism seem sane. The reality, though, is that liberalism is every bit as radical, insane, and revolutionary as communism is. And finally, I just want to say something about a common feature of liberal people like James Lindsay when they go and try to examine or try to explain illiberal ideologies. One thing they often do is they allow their liberal prejudices to define the ideology rather than allowing the exponents of the ideology to define it themselves. And so what we get with James Lindsay is that everyone gets to define Marxism except Karl Marx. We have to defer to this very strained metaphor in which Marxism is religious and Marxism is like esotericism, when Marx himself never referred to Marxism in a religious or mystical way. In fact, he made a very specific point to avoid any kind of mystification. And you get a very similar thing when liberals try to analyze fascism. Like, for example, you get people like Umberto Eco, who he's not really a liberal, but the same kind of thing happens all the time. You get this heuristic analysis of fascism. Like, instead of pointing out what the actual fascist doctrine is or what fascists define themselves as, liberals and people like Umberto Eco will just say, oh, well, these are the characteristics of fascism, and anything with these characteristics or these vibes is fascism. And so pretty much anything can be fascism if you contort it enough. And this is essentially what Lindsay is doing. He's just saying, like, anything that shares these religious qualities is like communism. But personally, I think defining communism is actually very simple. You just look at the actual communist doctrines themselves. Communists define themselves perfectly reasonably. They'll say it's a materialistic revolutionary movement. And wow, would you look at that? It's a materialistic revolutionary movement. They'll say that it's a science of history. And wow, would you look at that? It's based on a historical theory of the outcomes of human conflict. And since Marx thinks dialectics are the laws of history and of nature, then he can say that in a sense, it's scientific. Now, of course, we could debate whether Marx is actually like a science in the sense of the empirical sciences. it's a science in the way that it's not like an art. It's not just like sort of this artistic method of interpreting history, but instead it's something that can make predictions and has made predictions. Those predictions were wrong, but it did make predictions. So in a way, Marxism is kind of scientific. So the way Marxists define themselves is actually kind of valid. And we don't need to go on this long detour of trying to compare Marxism with religion. It's just simply not necessary.